Chapter 41 of Unknown to History by Charlotte Mary Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. Chapter 41. Her Royal Highness. Cicely had been living in almost as much suspense in London as her mother at Fotheringay. For greater security, Mr. Talbot had kept her on board the Mastiff till he had seen Monsieur de Chateauneuf, and had presented to him Queen Mary's letter. The ambassador, an exceedingly polished and graceful Frenchman, was greatly astonished, and at first incredulous, but he could not but accept the Queen's letter as genuine, and he called into his councils his Secretary de Salmonnet, an elderly man whose wife, a Scotswoman by birth, preferred her husband's society to the delights of Paris. She was a Hamilton who had been a pensionnaire in the convent at Soissons, and she knew that it had been expected that an infant from Lochleven might be sent to the abbess, but that it had never come, and that after many months of waiting, tidings had arrived that the vessel which carried the babe had been lost at sea. Monsieur de Chateauneuf thereupon committed the investigation to her and her husband. Richard Talbot took them first to the rooms where Mrs. Barbara Curll had taken up her abode, so as to be near her husband, who was still a prisoner in Walsingham's house. She fully confirmed all that Mr. Talbot said of the Queen's complete acceptance of Cis as her daughter, and moreover consented to come with the Salmonnets and Mr. Talbot to visit the young lady on board the Mastiff. Accordingly they went down the river together in Mr. Talbot's boat, and found Cicely, well cloaked and muffled, sitting under an awning, and under the care of old Goatley, who treated her like a little queen, and was busy explaining to her all the different craft which filled the river. She sprang up with the utmost delight at the sight of Mrs. Curll, and threw herself into her arms. There was an interchange of inquiries and comments that, unpremeditated as they were, could not but convince the auditor of the terms on which the young lady had stood with Queen Mary and her suite. Afterwards, Cicely took the two ladies to her cabin, a tiny box, but not uncomfortable according to her habits, and there, on Barbara's persuasion, she permitted Madame de Salmonnet to see the monograms on her shoulders. The lady went home convinced of her identity, and came again the next day with a gentleman in slouched hat, mask, and cloak. As Cicely rose to receive him, he uttered an exclamation of irrepressible astonishment, then added, "Your Highness will pardon me. Exactly thus did her royal mother stand when I took leave of her at Calais." The ambassador had thus been taken by storm, although the resemblance was more in figure and gesture than feature, but Mrs. Curll could aver that those who had seen Bothwell were at no loss to trace the derivation of the dark brows and somewhat homely features, in which the girl differed from the royal race of Scotland. What was to be done? Queen Mary's letter to him begged him so far as was possible to give her French protection, and avoid compromising that excellent Talbot, and he thought it would be wisest for her to await the coming of the envoy extraordinary, Monsieur de Pompon Bellevue, and be presented by him. In the meantime, her remaining on board ship in this winter weather would be miserably uncomfortable, and Richmond and Greenwich were so near that any intercourse with her would be dangerous, especially if Langston was still in England. Lodgings or inns where a young lady from the country could safely be bestowed were not easily to be procured without greater familiarity with the place than Mr. Talbot possessed, and he could as little think of placing her with Lady Talbot, whose gossiping tongue and shrewish temper were not for a moment to be trusted. Therefore Monsieur de Chateauneuf's proposal that the young lady should become Madame de Salmonnet's guest at the embassy was not unwelcome. The lady was elderly, Scottish, and as Monsieur de Chateauneuf with something of a shudder assured Mr. Talbot, most respectable, and it was hoped that it would not be for long. So having seen her safely made over to the lady's care, Richard ventured for the first time to make his presence in London known to his son and to his kindred, and he was the more glad to have her in these quarters, because Diccon told him that there was no doubt that Langston was lurking about the town, and indeed he was convinced that he had recognised that spy entering Walsingham's house in the dress of a scrivener. He would not alarm Cicely, but he bade her keep all her goods in a state ready for immediate departure, in case it should be needful to leave London at once after seeing the Queen. The French ambassador's abode was an old conventual building on the riverside, consisting of a number of sets of separate chambers like those of a college, opening on a quadrangle in the centre, and with one side occupied by the state apartments and chapel. This arrangement eminently suited the French suite, every one of whom liked to have his own little arrangements of cookery, and to look after his own marmite in his own way, all being alike horrified at the gross English diet and lack of vegetables. Many tried experiments in the way of growing salads in little gardens of their own, with little heed to the once beautiful green grass plot, which they broke up. Inside that gate it was like a new country, and as all the shrill, thin intonations of the French rang in her ears, Cicely could hardly believe that she had, she said, only a brick wall between her and old England. Monsieur de Salmonnet was unmistakably a Scot by descent, though he had never seen the land of his ancestors. His grandfather had been ennobled, but only belonged to the lesser order of the noblesse, being exempted from imposts, but not being above employment, especially in diplomacy. He had acted as secretary, interpreter, and general factotum to a whole succession of ambassadors, and thus his little lodge, as he called it, had become something of a home. His wife had once or twice before had to take charge of young ladies, French or English, who were confined to the embassy, and she had a guest chamber for them, a small room, but with an oriel window overhanging the Thames, and letting in the southern sun, so as almost to compensate for the bareness of the rest, where there was nothing but a square box bed, a chest, and a few toilette essentials, to break upon the dullness of the dark wainscoted walls. Madame herself came to sleep with her guest, for lonely nights were regarded with dread in those times, and indeed she seemed to regard it as her duty never to lose sight of her charge for a moment. Madame de Salmonnet's proper bedchamber was the only approach to this little room, but that mattered the less as it was also the parlour. The bed, likewise a box, was in the far-off recesses, and the family were up and astir long before the November sun. Dressed, Madame could scarcely be called. The costume in which she assisted Babette and queer wizened old Pierrot in doing the morning's work horrified Cicely, used as she was to Mistress Susan's scrupulous neatness. Downstairs there was a sort of office room of Monsieur's, where the family meals were taken, and behind it an exceedingly small kitchen, where Madame and Pierrot performed marvels of cookery, surpassing those of Queen Mary's 5 cooks. Cicely longed to assist in them, and after a slight demur she was permitted to do so, chiefly because her duenna could not otherwise watch her and the confections at the same time. Cis could never make out whether it was as a princess or simply as maiden that she was so closely watched, for Madame bristled and swelled like a mother cat about to spring at a strange dog, if any gentleman of the suite showed symptoms of accosting her. Nay, when Mr. Talbot once brought Diccon in with him, and there was a greeting, which to Cicely's mind was dismally cold and dry, the lady was so scandalized that Cicely was obliged formally to tell her that she would answer for it to the Queen. On Sunday Mr. Talbot always came to take her to church, and this was a terrible grievance to Madame. If it had been only the being out of hearing of her hostess's incessant tongue, the walk would have been a refreshment. Madame de Salmonnet had been transported from home so young that she was far more French than Scottish. She was a small woman, full of activity and zeal of all kinds, though perhaps most of all for her porte-à-faux. She was busied about her domestic affairs morning, noon, and night, and never ceased chattering the whole time, till Cicely began to regard the sound like the clack of the mill at Bridgefield. Yet, talker as she was a safe woman, and never had been known to betray secrets. Indeed, much more of her conversation consisted of speculations on the tenderness of the poultry or the freshness of the fish, than of anything that went much deeper. She did, however, spend much time in describing the habits and customs of the pensionnaires at Soissons, the meagre food they had to eat, their tricks upon the elder and graver nuns, and a good deal besides that was amusing at first, but which became rather wearisome, and made Cicely wonder what either of her mothers would have thought of it. The excuse for all this was to enable the maiden to make her appearance before Queen Elizabeth as freshly brought from Soissons by her mother's danger. Mary herself had suggested this, as removing all danger from the Talbots, and as making it easier for the French embassy to claim and protect Cis herself, and Monsieur de Chateauneuf had so far acquiesced as to desire Madame de Salmonnet to see whether the young lady could be prepared to assume the character before eyes that would not be overqualified to judge. Cis, however, had always been passive when the proposal was made, and the more she heard from Madame de Salmonnet, the more averse she was to it. The only consideration that seemed to her in its favour was the avoidance of implicating her foster father, but a Sunday morning spent with him removed the scruple. "I know I cannot feign," she said. "They all used to laugh at me at Chartley for being too much of the downright mastiff to act a part." "I am right glad to hear it," said Richard. "Moreover," added Cicely, "if I did try to turn my words with a Scottish or French ring, I wot that the sight of the Queen's Majesty and my anxiety would drive out from me all I should strive to remember, and I should falter and utter mere folly, and if she saw I was deceiving her, there would be no hope at all. Nay, how could I ask God Almighty to bless my doing with a lie in my mouth?" "There spoke my Susan's own maid," said Richard. "'Tis the joy of my heart that they have not been able to teach thee to lie with a good grace. Trust my word, my wench, truth is the only wisdom, and one would have thought they might have learnt it by this time." "I only doubted lest it should be to your damage, dear father. Can they call it treason?" "I trow not, my child. The worst that could hap would be that I might be lodged in prison a while, or have to pay a fine, and liefer, far liefer, would I undergo the like than that those lips of thine should learn guile. I say not that there is safety for any of us, least of all for thee, my poor maid, but the danger is tenfold increased by trying to deceive, and moreover it cannot be met with a good conscience." "Moreover," said Cicely, "I have pleadings and promises to make on my mother Queen's behalf that would come strangely amiss if I had to feign that I had never seen her. May I not seek the Queen at once, without waiting for this French gentleman? Then would this weary, weary time be at an end. Each time I hear a bell or a cannon shot, I start and think, oh, has she signed the warrant? Is it too late?" "There is no fear of that," said Richard. "I shall know from Will Cavendish the instant aught is done, and through Dickon I could get thee brought to the Queen's very chamber in time to plead. Meantime the Queen is in many minds. She cannot bear to give up her kinswoman. She sits apart and mutters, aught for aught fairy, and ne feriare fairy. Her ladies say she tosses and sighs all night, and hath once or twice awoke shrieking that she was covered with blood. It is Burghley and Walsingham who are forcing this on, and not her free will. Strengthen but her better will, and let her feel herself secure, and she will spare, and gladly." "That do I hope to do," said Cicely, encouraged. The poor girl had to endure many a vicissitude and heart-sinking before M. de Bellievre appeared, and when he did come he was a disappointment. He was a most magnificent specimen of the minions of Henry's court. The embassy rang with stories of the number of mails he had brought, of the milk baths he sent for, the gloves he slept in, the valets who tweaked out the superfluous hairs from his eyebrows, the delicacies required for his little dogs. Monsieur de Salmonnet reported that on hearing the story of Mamselle, as Cicely was called in the embassy, he had twirled the wax ends of his moustaches into a satirical twist, and observed, "That is well found, and may serve as a last resource." He never would say that he disbelieved what he was told of her, and when presented to her he behaved with an exaggerated deference which angered her intensely, for it seemed to her mockery of her pretensions. No doubt his desire was that Mary's life should be granted to the intercession of his king, rather than to any other consideration, and therefore once, twice, thrice he had interviews with Elizabeth, and still he would not take the anxious supplicant, who was in an agony at each disappointment, as she watched the gay barge float down the river, and who began to devise setting forth alone to seek the Queen at Richmond and end it all. She would have done so, but that Dickon told her that since the alarm caused by Barnwell, it had become so much more difficult to approach the Queen that she would have no hope. But she was in a restless state that made Madame de Salmonnet's chatter almost distracting, when at last, far on in January, Monsieur de Salmonnet came in. "Well, mademoiselle, the moment is come. The passports are granted, but Monsieur the Ambassador Extraordinary has asked for a last private audience, and he prays your Highness to be ready to accompany him at 9 of the clock tomorrow morning." Cicely's first thought was to send tidings to Mr. Talbot, and in this Monsieur de Salmonnet assisted her, though his wife thought it very superfluous to drag in the great, dull, heavy English sailor. The girl longed for a sight and speech of him all that evening in vain, though she was sure she saw the Mastiff's boat pass down the river, and most earnestly did she wish she could have had her chamber to herself for the prayers and preparations, on which Madame's tongue broke so intolerably that she felt as if she would ere long be wild and senseless, and unable to recollect anything. She had only a little peace when Madame rose early in the morning and left her, thinking her asleep for a brief interval, which gave her time to rally her thoughts and commend herself to her only guide. She let Madame dress her, as had been determined, in perfectly plain black, with a cap that would have suited a novice out of convent shade. It was certainly the most suitable garb for a petitioner for her mother's life. In her hand she took the Queen's letter, and the most essential proofs of her birth. She was cloaked and hooded over all as warmly as possible to encounter the cold of the river, and Madame de Salmonnet, sighing deeply at the cold, arranged herself to chaperon her, and tried to make her fortify herself with food, but she was too tremulous to swallow anything but a little bread and wine. Poor child! She felt frightfully alone amongst all those foreign tongues, above all when the two ambassadors crossed the court to Monsieur de Salmonnet's little door. Bellevue, rolled up in splendid sables from head to foot, bowed down to the ground before her, almost sweeping the pavement with his plume, and asked in his deferential voice of mockery if her Royal Highness would do him the honour of accepting his escort. Cicely bent her head and said in French, "I thank you, sir," giving him her hand, and there was a grave dignity in the action that repressed him, so that he did not speak again as he led her to the barge, which was covered in at the stern so as to afford a shelter from the wind. Her quick eye detected the Mastiff's boat as she was handed down the stairs, and this was some relief while she was placed in the seat of honour, with an ambassador on each side of her. "May I ask," demanded Bellevue, waving a scented handkerchief, "what her Highness is prepared to say in case I have to confirm it?" "I thank your Excellency," replied Cicely, "but I mean to tell the simple truth, and as your Excellency has had no previous knowledge of me, I do not see how you can confirm it." The two gentlemen looked at one another, and Chateauneuf said, "Do I understand her Royal Highness that she does not come as the pensionnaire from Soissons, as the Queen had recommended?" "No, sir," said Cicely. "I have considered the matter, and I could not support the character. All I ask of your Excellencies is to bring me into the presence of Queen Elizabeth. I will do the rest myself with the help of God." "Perhaps she is right," said one ambassador to the other. "These English are incomprehensible." End of chapter 41. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. Chapter 42 of Unknown to History by Charlotte Mary Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. The Supplication. In due time the boat drew up at the stairs leading to the palace of Richmond. Cicely, in the midst of her trepidation, perceived that Diccon was among the gentlemen pensioners who made a lane from the landing to receive them, as she was handed along by Monsieur de Bellevue. In the hall there was a pause, during which the mufflings were thrown off, and Cicely appeared in her simple black, a great contrast to her cavalier, who was clad from neck to knee in pale pink satin, quilted, and with a pearl at each intersection, earrings in his ears, perfumed and long-fringed gloves in his hand, a perfect specimen of the foppery of the court of France. However, he might have been in hodden grey without her perceiving it. She had the sensation of having plunged into deep unknown waters without rope or plank, and being absolutely forced to strike out for herself. Yet the very urgency of the moment, acting on her high blood and recent training, made her outwardly perfectly self-possessed and calm. She walked along, holding her head in the regal manner that was her inheritance, and was so utterly absorbed in the situation that she saw nothing and thought only of the Queen. This was to be a private audience, and after a minute's demur with the clerk of the chamber, when Chateauneuf made some explanation, a door was opened, a curtain withdrawn, and the two ambassadors and the young lady were admitted to Elizabeth's closet, where she sat alone in an armchair with a table before her. Cicely's first glance at the Queen reminded her of the Countess, though the face was older, and had an intellect and a grandeur latent in it, such as Bess of Hardwicke had never possessed. But it was haggard and worn, and eyelids red, either with weeping or with sleeplessness, and there was an anxious look about the keen, light hazel eyes, which was sometimes almost pathetic, and gave Cicely hope. To the end of her days she never could recollect how the Queen was arrayed. She saw nothing but the expression in those falcon eyes, and the strangely sensitive mouth, which bewrayed the shrewish nose and chin, and the equally inconsistent firmness of the jaw. The first glance Cicely encountered was one of utter amazement and wrath, as the Queen exclaimed, "Whom have you brought hither, messieurs?" Before either could reply, she, whom they had thought a raw, helpless girl, moved forward, and, kneeling before Elizabeth, said, "It is I, so please your Majesty, I who have availed myself of the introduction of their Excellencies to lay before your Majesty a letter from my mother, the Queen of Scots." Queen Elizabeth made so vehement and incredulous an exclamation of amazement that Cicely was the more reminded of the Countess, and this perhaps made her task the easier, and besides, she was not an untrained rustic, but had really been accustomed to familiar intercourse with a queen, who, captive as she was, maintained full state and etiquette. She therefore made answer with dignity, "If it will please your Majesty to look at this letter, you will see the proofs of what I say, and that I am indeed Bride Hepburn, the daughter of Queen Mary's last marriage. I was born at Lochleven on the 20th of February of the year of grace 1567, and thence secretly sent in the Bride of Dunbar to be bred up in France. The ship was wrecked, and all lost on board, but I was, by the grace of God, picked up by a good and gallant gentleman of my Lord of Shrewsbury's following, Master Richard Talbot of Bridgefield, who brought me up as his own daughter, all unknowing whence I came or who I was, until 3 years ago, when one of the secret agents, who had knowledge of the affairs of the Queen of Scots, made known to her that I was the babe who had been embarked in the Bride of Dunbar." "Verily, thou must be a bold wench to expect me to believe such a mere minstrel's tale," said Elizabeth. "Nevertheless, madam, it is the simple truth, as you will see if you deign to open this packet." "And who or where is this same honourable gentleman who brought you up? Richard Talbot? I have heard that name before." "He is here, madam. He will confirm all I say." The Queen touched a little bell, and ordered Master Talbot of Bridgefield to be brought to her, while, hastily casting her eyes on the credentials, she demanded of Chateauneuf, "Know you aught of this, sir?" "I only know what the Queen of Scotland has written, and what this Monsieur Talbot has told me, madame," said Chateauneuf. "There can be no doubt that the Queen of Scotland has treated her as a daughter, and owns her for such in her letter to me, as well as to your Majesty." "And the letters are no forgery?" "Mine is assuredly not, madame. I know the private hand of the Queen of Scots too well to be deceived. Moreover, Madame Curll, the wife of the Secretary, and others can speak to the manner in which this young lady was treated." "Openly treated as a daughter! That passes, sir. My faithful subjects would never have left me uninformed." "So please your Majesty," here the maiden ventured, "I have always borne the name of Cicely Talbot, and no one knows what is my real birth, save those who were with my mother at Lochleven, excepting Mrs. Curll. The rest even of her own attendants only understood me to be a Scottish orphan. My true lineage should never have been known, were it not a daughter's duty to plead for her mother." By this time Mr. Talbot was at the door, and he was received by the Queen with, "So ho, Mr. Talbot, how is this? You that have been vaunted to us as the very pink of fidelity, working up a tale that smacks mightily of treason and leasing." "The truth is oft stranger than any playwright can devise," said Richard as he knelt. "If it be truth, the worse for you, sir," said the Queen hotly. "What colour can you give to thus hiding one who might, forsooth, claim royal blood, tainted though it be?"
"Pardon me, your Grace. For many years I knew not who the babe was whom I had taken from the wreck, and when the secret of her birth was discovered, I deemed it not mine own, but that of the Queen of Scots." "A captive's secrets are not her own, and are only kept by traitors," said Elizabeth severely.
At this Cicely threw herself forward with glowing cheeks. "Madam, madam, traitor never was named in the same breath with Mr. Talbot's name before. If he kept the secret, it was out of pity, and knowing no hurt could come to your Majesty by it."
"Thou hast a tongue, wench, be thou who thou mayest," said Elizabeth sharply. "Stand back, and let him tell his own tale."
Richard very briefly related the history of the rescue of the infant, which he said he could confirm by the testimony of Goatley and of Heatherthwayte. He then explained how Langston had been present when she was brought home, and had afterwards made communications to the Queen of Scots that led to the girl, already in attendance on her, being claimed and recognised, after which he confessed that he had not the heart to do what might separate the mother and daughter by declaring their relationship. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was evidently comparing his narrative with the letters of the Queen of Scots, asking searching questions here and there. She made a sound of perplexity and annoyance at the end, and said, "This must be further inquired into." Here Cicely, fearing an instant dismissal, clasped her hands, and on her knees exclaimed, "Madam, it will not matter. No trouble shall ever be caused by my drop of royal blood. No one shall ever even know that the Bride of Scotland exists, save the few who now know it, and have kept the secret most faithfully. I seek no state. All I ask is my mother's life. Oh, madam, would you but see her and speak with her, you would know how far from her thoughts is any evil to your royal person."
"Tush, wench, we know better. Is this thy lesson?"
"None hath taught me any lesson, madam. I know what my mother's enemies have, as they say, proved against her, and I know they say that while she lives your Grace cannot be in security."
"That is what moves my people to demand her death," said Elizabeth.
"It is not of your own free will, madam, nor of your own kind heart," cried Cicely. "That I well know, and madam, I will show you the way. Let but my mother be escorted to some convent abroad, in France or Austria, or anywhere beyond the reach of Spain, and her name should be hidden from every one. None should know where to seek her, not even the abbess should know her name. She would be imprisoned in a cell, but she would be happy, for she would have life and the free exercise of her religion. No English papist, no leaguer, none should ever trace her, and she would disquiet you no more."
"And who is to answer that, when once beyond English bounds she should not stir up more trouble than ever?" demanded Elizabeth.
"That do I," said the girl. "Here am I, Bride Hepburn, ready to live in your Majesty's hands as a hostage, whom you might put to death at the first stirring on her behalf."
"Silly maid, we have no love of putting folk to death," said Elizabeth, rather hurt. "That is only for traitors, when they forfeit our mercy."
"Then, oh madam, madam, what has been done in her name cannot forfeit mercy for her. She was shut up in prison. I was with her day and night, and I know she had naught to do with any evil purpose towards your Majesty. Ah, you do not believe me. I know they have found her guilty, and that is not what I came to say," she continued, getting bewildered in her earnestness for a moment. "No, but, gracious Queen, you have spared her often. I have heard her say that you had again and again saved her life from those who would fain have her blood."
"It is true," said Elizabeth, half softened.
"Save her then now, madam," entreated the girl. "Let her go beyond their reach. Yet when none shall find her to use her name against you, let me go to her at Fotheringay with these terms. She will consent, and bless and pray for you for ever. And here am I, ready to do what you will with me."
"To hang about court, and be found secretly wedded to some base groom."
"No, madam, I give you my solemn word as a Queen's daughter that I will never wed save by your consent if my mother's life be granted. The King of Scots knows not that there is such a being. He need never know it. I will thank and bless you whether you throw me into the Tower, or let me abide as the humblest of your serving women, under the name I have always borne, Cicely Talbot."
"Foolish maid, thou mayest purpose as thou sayest, but I know what wenches are made of too well to trust thee."
"Ah, madam, pardon me, but you know not how strong a maiden's heart can be for a mother's sake. Madam, you have never seen my mother. If you but knew her patience and her tenderness, you would know how not only I, but every man or woman in her train would gladly lay down life and liberty for her, could we but break her bonds, and win her a shelter among those of her own faith."
"Art thou a papist?" asked the Queen, observing the pronoun.
"Not so, an it please your Majesty. This gentleman bred me up in our own church, nor would I leave it."
"Strange, strange matters," muttered Elizabeth, "and they need to be duly considered."
"I will then abide your Majesty's pleasure," said Cicely, "craving license that it may be at Fotheringay with my mother. Then can I bear her the tidings, and she will write in full her consent to these terms. Oh, madam, I see mercy in your looks. Receive a daughter's blessing and thanks."
Over fast, maiden. Who told thee that I had consented?"
"Your Majesty's own countenance," replied Cicely readily. "I see pity in it, and the recollection that all posterity for evermore will speak of the clemency of Elizabeth as the crown of all her glories."
"Child, child," said the Queen, really moved, "Heaven knows that I would gladly practise clemency if my people would suffer it, but they fear for my life, and still more for themselves, were I removed, nor can I blame them."
"Your Majesty, I know that, but my mother would be dead to the world, leaving her rights solemnly made over to her son. None would know where to find her, and she would leave in your hands and those of the Parliament a resignation of all her claims."
"And would she do this? Am I to take it on thy word, girl?"
"Your Majesty knows this ring sent to her at Lochleven?" said Cicely, holding it up. "It is the pledge that she binds herself to these conditions. Oh, let me but bear them to her, and you shall have them signed and sealed, and your Majesty will know the sweet bliss of pardoning. May I carry the tidings to her? I can go with this gentleman, assist Talbot returning to her service."
Elizabeth bent her head as though assenting thoughtfully.
"How shall I thank you, gracious Queen?" cried Cicely, joining hands in a transport, but Elizabeth sharply cut her short.
"What means the wench? I have promised nothing. I have only said I will look into this strange story of thine, and consider this a proposal. That is, if thy mother, as thou callest her, truly intend it, ay, and will keep to it."
"That is all I could ask of your Majesty," said Cicely. "The next messenger after my return shall carry her full consent to these conditions, and there will I abide your pleasure until the time comes for her to be conducted to her convent, if not to see your face, which would be best of all. Oh, madam, what thanks will be worthy of such a grace?"
"Wait to see whether it is a grace, little cousin," said Elizabeth, but with a kiss to the young round cheek, and a friendliness of tone that surprised all. "Messieurs," she added to the ambassadors, "you came, if I mistake not, to bring me this young demoiselle?"
"Who has, I hope, pleaded more effectually than I," returned Bellievre.
"I have made no promises, sir," said the Queen, drawing herself up proudly.
"Still your Majesty forbids us not to hope,"
said Chateauneuf. Wherewith they found themselves dismissed. There was a great increase of genuine respect in the manner in which Bellievre handed the young lady from the Queen's chamber through the gallery and hall, and finally to the boat. No one spoke, for there were many standing around, but Cicely could read in a glance that passed between the Frenchmen that they were astonished at her success. Her own brain was in a whirl, her heart beating high. She could hardly realize what had passed, but when again placed in the barge, the first words she heard were from Bellievre.
"Your Royal Highness will permit me to congratulate you."
At the same time she saw to her great joy that Monsieur de Chateauneuf had caused her foster father to enter the barge with them.
"If the Queen of Scotland were close at hand, the game would be won," said Bellievre. "Ah, my Lord Treasurer and Monsieur the Secretaire are far too cunning to have let her be within reach," said Chateauneuf. "Could we but have bound the Queen to anything," added Bellievre. "That she always knows how to avoid," said the resident ambassador.
"At least," said Cicely, "she has permitted that I should bear the terms to my mother at Fotheringay."
"That is true," said Chateauneuf, "and in my opinion no time should be lost in so doing. I doubt," he added, looking at Richard, "whether now that her Highness's exalted rank is known, the embassy will be permitted to remain a shelter to her. in case the Queen should demand her of me." "Your Excellency speaks my thought," said Richard. "I am even disposed to believe that it would be wiser to begin our journey this very day." "I grieve for the apparent inhospitality and disrespect to one whom I honour so highly," said Chateauneuf, "but I verily believe it would be the wiser plan. Look you, sir, the enemies of the unfortunate Queen of Scotland have done all in their power to hinder my colleague from seeing the Queen, but to-day the Lord Treasurer is occupied at Westminster, and Monsieur the Secretaire is sick. She sent for us in one of those wilful moods in which she chooses to assert herself without their knowledge, and she remains, as it were, stunned by the surprise, and touched by her Royal Highness's pleading. But let these gentlemen discover what has passed, or let her recover and send for them, and bah! They will inquire, and messengers will go forth at once to stop her Highness and yourself. All will be lost. But if you can actually be on the way to this castle before they hear of it, and it is possible you may have a full day in advance, they will be unable to hinder the conditions from being laid before the Queen of Scots, and we are witnesses of what they were."
"Oh, let us go at once, dear sir," entreated Cicely. "I burn to carry my mother this hope." It was not yet noon, so early had been the audience, and dark and short as were the days, it was quite possible to make some progress on the journey before night. Cicely had kept the necessaries for her journey ready, and so had Mr. Talbot, even to the purchase of horses, which were in the Shrewsbury House stables. The rest of the mails could be fetched by the Mastiff's crew, and brought to Hull under charge of Goatley. Madame de Salmonnet was a good deal scandalized at the Royal going off with only a male escort, and to Cicely's surprise wept over her, and prayed aloud that she might have good success, and bring safety and deliverance to the good and persecuted Queen, for whom she had attempted so much. "Sir," said Chateauneuf, as he stood beside Richard, waiting until the girl's preparations were over, "if there could have been any doubts of the royal lineage of your charge, her demeanour to-day would have disproved him. She stood there speaking as an equal, all undaunted before that Queen before whom all tremble, save when they can cajole her." "She stood there in the strength of truth and innocence," said Richard, whereat the Frenchman again looked perplexed at these incomprehensible English. Cicely presently appeared. It was wonderful to see how that one effort had given her dignity and womanhood. She thanked the two ambassadors for the countenance they had given to her, and begged them to continue their exertions in her mother's cause. "And," she added, "I believe my mother has already requested of you to keep this matter a secret." They bowed, and she added, "You perceive, gentlemen, that the very conditions I have offered involve secrecy both as to my mother's future abode and my existence. Therefore I trust that you will not consider it inconsistent with your duty to the King of France to send no word of this." Again they assured her of their secrecy, and the promise was so far kept that the story was reserved for the private ear of Henri III on Bellevue's return, and never put into the dispatches. 2 days later, Cicely enjoyed some of the happiest hours of her life. She stood by the bed where her mother was lying, and was greeted with the cry, my child, I thought I should never see thee more. Domini nunc dimittis." "Nay, dearest mother, but I trust she will show mercy. I bring you conditions." Mary laid her head on her daughter's shoulder and listened. It might be that she had too much experience of Elizabeth's vacillations to entertain much hope of her being allowed to retire beyond her grasp into a foreign convent, and she declared that she could not endure that her beloved, devoted child should wear away her life under Elizabeth's jealous eye. But Cis put this aside, saying with a smile, "I think she will not be hard with me. She will be no worse than my Lady Countess, and I shall have a secret of joy within me in thinking of you resting among the good nuns." And Mary caught hope from the anticipations she would not damp, and gave herself to the description of the peaceful cloister life, reviewing in turn the nunneries she had heard described, and talking over their rules. There would indeed be as little liberty as here, but she would live in the midst of prayer and praise, and be at rest from the plots and plans, the hopes and fears of her long captivity, and be at leisure for penitence. For my child, guiltless though I be of much that is laid to my charge, thy mother is a sinful woman.
all unworthy of what her brave and innocent daughter has dared and done for her." Almost equally precious with that mother's greeting was the grave, congratulating look of approval which Cicely met in Humfrey's eyes when he had heard all from his father. He could exult in her, even while he thought sadly of the future which she had so bravely risked, watching over her from a distance in his silent, self-restrained, unselfish devotion. The Queen's coldness towards Humfrey had meantime diminished daily, though he could not guess whether she really viewed his course as the right one, or whether she forgave this as well as all other injuries in the calm, gentle state into which she had come, not greatly moved by hope or fear, content alike to live or die. Richard, in much anxiety, was to remain another day or two at Fotheringay, on the plea of his wearied horses and of the Sunday rest. Meantime Mary diligently wrote the conditions, but perhaps more to satisfy her daughter than with much hope of their acceptance. End of chapter 42. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. Chapter 43 of Unknown to History by Charlotte Mary Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. The Warrant.
"Yea, madam, they are gone. They stole away at once, and are far on the way to Fotheringay with these same conditions." So spoke Davison, Under Secretary, Walsingham being still indisposed. "And therefore will I see whether the Queen of Scots will ratify them ere I go farther in the matter," returned Elizabeth. "She will ratify them without question," said the Secretary ironically, "seeing that to escape into the hands of one of your Majesty's enemies is just what she desires." "She leaves her daughter as a pledge?" "Yea, a piece of tinsel to delude your Majesty." Elizabeth swore an oath that there was truth in every word and gesture of the maiden. "The poor wench may believe all she said herself," said Davidson. "Nay, she is much deluded as the rest, and so is that honest dull-pated sailor Talbot. If your Majesty will permit me to call in a fellow I have here, I can make all plain." "Who is he? You know I cannot abide those foul carrion rascals you make use of," said Elizabeth with an air of disgust. "This man is gentleman born. Villain he may be, but there is naught to offend your Majesty in him. He is one Langston, a kinsman of this Talbot's, and having once been a Papist, but now having seen the error of his ways, he did good service in the unwinding of the late horrible plot." "Well, if no other way will serve you, but I must hear the fellow, have him in." A neatly dressed, small, elderly man, entirely arrayed in black, was called in, and knelt most humbly before the Queen. Being bidden to tell what he knew respecting the lady who had appeared before the Queen the day before, calling herself Bride Hepburn, he returned for answer that he believed it to be verily her name, but that she was the daughter of a man who had fled to France and become an archer of the Scottish Guard. He told how he had been at Hull when the infant had been saved from the wreck, and brought home to Mistress Susan Talbot, who left the place the next day, and had, he understood, bred up the child as her own. He himself, being then, as he confessed, led astray by the delusions of Popery, had much commerce with the Queen's party, and had learnt from some of the garrison of Dunfermline that the child on board the lost ship was the offspring of this same Hepburn, and one of the Queen Mary's many namesake kindred who had died in childbirth at Lochleven. And now Langston professed bitterly to regret what he had done, when in his disguise at Buxton he had made known to some of Mary's suite that the supposed Cicely Talbot was of their country and kindred. She had been immediately made a great favourite by the Queen of Scots, and all the attendants knew who she really was, though she still went by the name of Talbot. He imagined that the Queen of Scots, whose charms were not so imperishable as those which dazzled his eyes at this moment, wanted a fresh bait for her victims, since she herself was growing old, and thus had actually succeeded in binding Babington to her service, though even then the girl was puffed up with notions of her own importance, and had flouted him. And now, all other hope having vanished, Queen Mary's last and ablest resource had been to possess the poor maiden with an idea of actually being her own child, and then to work on her filial obedience to offer herself as a hostage, whom Mary herself could without scruple leave to her fate, so soon as she was ready to head an army of invaders. Davison further added that the secretary now could corroborate that Bride Hepburn was known to the suite as a kinswoman of the Queen, and that Mr. Cavendish, clerk to Sir Francis Walsingham, knew that Babington had been suitor to the young lady, and had crossed swords with young Talbot on her account. Elizabeth listened, and made no comment at the time, save that she sharply questioned Langston, but his tale was perfectly coherent, and as it threw the onus of the deception entirely on Mary, it did not conflict either with the sincerity evident in both Cicely and her foster father, or with the credentials supplied by the Queen of Scots. Of the ciphered letter and of the monograms Elizabeth had never heard, though if she had asked for further proof they would have been brought forward. She heard all, dismissed Langston, and with some petulance bade Davison likewise begone, being aware that her ministers meant to draw to her the moral that she had involved herself in difficulties by holding a private audience of the French ambassadors without their knowledge or presence. It may be that the very sense of having been touched exasperated her the more. She paced up and down the room restlessly, and her ladies heard her muttering, "That she should cheat me thus! I have pitied her often. I will pity her no more. To breed up that poor child to be palmed on me! I will make an end of it. I can endure this no longer. These tossings to and fro are more than I can bear, and all for one who is false, 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 false. My brain will bear no more. Hap what hap, an end must be made of it. She or I must die, and which is best for England and the faith? That girl had well nigh made me pity her, and it was all a vile cheat." Thus it was that Elizabeth sent for Davison, and bade him bring the warrant with him. And thus it was that in the midst of dinner in the hall on the Sunday, the 5th of February, the Menie of the castle was startled by the arrival of Mr. Beale, the clerk of the council, always a bird of sinister omen, and accompanied by a still more alarming figure, a strong, burly man, clad in black velvet from head to foot. Every one knew who he was, and a thrill of dismay that what had been so long expected had come at last went through all who saw him pass through the hall. Sir Amias was summoned from table, and remained in conference with the two arrivals all through evening chapel time, an event in itself extraordinary enough to excite general anxiety. It was Humfrey's turn to be on guard, and he had not long taken his station before he was called into the Queen's apartments, where she sat at the foot of her bed, in a large chair with a small table before her. No one was with her but her two mediciners, Bourgoin and Gorion. "Here," she said, "is the list our good doctor has writ of the herbs he requires for my threatened attack of rheumatism. I will endeavour, with Sir Amias's permission, to seek them in the park," said Humfrey. "But tell me," said Mary, fixing her clear eyes upon him, "tell me truly, is there not a surer and more lasting cure for all my ills in preparation? Who was it who arrived to-night?"
"Madam," said Humfrey, bowing his head low as he knelt on one knee, "it was Mr. Beale."
"Ay, and who besides?"
"Madam, I heard no name, but—" As she waited for him to speak further, he uttered in a choked voice, "It was one clad in black."
"I perceive," said Mary, looking up with a smile, "a more effectual doctor than you, my good Bourgoin. I thank God and my cousin Elizabeth for giving me the martyr's hope at the close of the most mournful life that ever woman lived. Nay, leave me not as yet, good Humfrey. I have somewhat to say unto thee. I have a charge for thee."
Something in her tone led him to look up earnestly into her face.
"Thou lovest my child, I think," she added.
The young man's voice was scarcely heard, and he only said, "Yea, madam." But there was an intensity in the tone and eyes which went to her heart.
"Thou dost not speak, but thou canst do. Wilt thou take her, Humfrey, and with her all the inheritance of peril and sorrow that dogs our unhappy race?"
"Oh!"
and there was a mighty sob that almost cut off his voice.
"My life is already hers.
and would be spent in her service wherever, whatever she was."
"I guessed it," said the Queen, letting her hand rest on his shoulder. "And for her thou wilt endure, if needful, suspicion, danger, exile."
"They will be welcome, so I may shield her."
"I trust thee," she said, and she took his firm, strong hand into her own white-waisted one. "But wilt thy father consent? Thou art his eldest son and heir."
"He loves her like his own daughter. My brother may have the lands."
"'Tis strange," said Mary, "that in wedding a princess 'tis no crown, no kingdom that is set before thee, only the loss of thine own inheritance. For now that the poor child has made herself known to Elizabeth, there will be no safety for her between these seas. I have considered it well. I had thought of sending her abroad with my French servants, and making her known to my kindred there. That would have been well if she could have accepted the true faith, or if her heart had not been thine. But to have sent her as she is would only expose her to persecution, and she hath not the mounting spirit that would cast aside love for the sake of rising. She lived too long with thy mother to be aught save a homely Cis. I would have made a princess of her, but it passes my powers. Nay, the question is, whether it may yet be possible to prevent the Queen from laying hands on her."
"My father is still here," said Humfrey, "and I deem not that any orders have come respecting her. Might not he crave permission to take her home? That is, if she will leave your Grace."
"I will lay my commands on her." "It is well thought of," said the Queen. "How soon canst thou have speech with him?"
"He is very likely to come to my post," said Humfrey. "Then we can walk the gallery and talk unheard."
"It is well. Let him make his demand, and I will have her ready to depart as early as may be to-morrow morn. Burgoyne, I would ask thee to call the maiden hither." Cicely appeared from the apartment where she had been sitting with the other ladies. "Child," said the Queen as she came in, "is thy mind set on wedding an Archduke?" "Marriage is not for me, madam," said Cicely, perplexed and shaken by this strange address and by Humfrey's presence. "Nay, didst not once tell me of a betrothal now many years ago? What wouldst say if thine own mother were to ratify it?" "Ah, madam," said Cicely, blushing crimson, however, "but I pledged myself never to wed, save with Queen Elizabeth's consent." "On one condition," said the Queen. "But if that condition were not observed by the other party—" "How? What? Mother!" exclaimed Cicely with a scream. "There is no fear. Humfrey, have you heard aught?" "Nothing is certain," said Mary calmly. "I ask thee not to break thy word. I ask thee, if thou wert free to marry, if thou wouldst be an Austrian or Lorraine Duchess, or consent thee with an honest English youth, whose plighted word is more precious to him than gold." "Oh, mother, how can you ask?" said Cicely, dropping down and hiding her face in the Queen's lap. "Then, Humfrey Talbot, I give her to thee, my child, my bride of Scotland. Thou wilt guard her, and shield her, and for thine own sake as well as hers, save her from the wrath and jealousy of Elizabeth. Hark, hark, rise, my child. They are presenting arms. We shall have Paulett in anon to convey my rare supper." They had only just time to compose themselves before Paulett came in, looking, as they all thought, grimmer and more starched than ever, and not well pleased to find Humfrey there, but the Queen was equal to the occasion. "Here is Dr. Burgoyne's list of the herbs that he needs to ease my aches," she said. "Master Talbot is so good to say that, being properly instructed, he will go in search of them."
"They will not be needed," said Paulett, but he spoke no farther to the Queen. Outside, however, he said to Humfrey, "Young man, you do not well to waste the Sabbath evening in converse with that blinded woman." And meeting Mr. Talbot himself on the stair, he said, "You are going in quest of your son, sir. You would do wisely to admonish him that he will bring himself into suspicion, if not worse, by loitering amid the snares and wiles of the woman whom wrath is even now overtaking."
Richard found his son pacing the gallery, almost choked with agitation, and with the endeavour to conceal it from the two stolid, heavy yeomen who dozed behind the screen.
Not till he had reached the extreme end did Humfrey master his voice enough to utter in his father's ear, "She has given her to me." Richard could not answer for a moment. Then he said, "I fear me it will be thy ruin, Humfrey." "Not ruin in love or faithfulness," said the youth. "Father, you know I should everywhere have followed her, and watched over her, even to the death, even if she could never have been mine." "I trow thou wouldest," said Richard. "Nor would you have it otherwise. Your child, your only daughter, to be left unguarded." "Nay, I know not that I would," said Richard. "I cannot but care for the poor maid like mine own, and I would not have thee less true-hearted, Humfrey, even though it cost thee thine home, and us our eldest son." "You have Diccon and Ned," said Humfrey. And then he told what had passed, and his father observed that Beale had evidently no knowledge of Cicely's conference with the Queen, and apparently no orders to seize her. It had oozed out that a commission had been sent to 5 noblemen to come and superintend the execution, since Sir Amias Paulett had again refused to let it take place without witnesses, and Richard undertook to apply at once to Sir Amias for permission to remove his daughter, on the ground of saving her tender youth from the shock. "Then," said he, "I will leave a token at Nottingham where I have taken her, whether home or at once to Hull. If I leave Brown Rundle at the end for thee, then come home. But if it be White Blossom, then come to Hull. It will be best that thou dost not know while here, and I cannot go directly to Hull, because the fens at this season may not be fit for riding. Heatherthwayte will need no proofs to convince him that she is not thy sister, and can wed you at once, and you will also be able to embark in case there be any endeavour to arrest her." "Taking service in Holland," said Humfrey, "till there may be safety in returning to England." Richard sighed. The risk and sacrifice were great, and it was to him like the loss of 2 children, but the die was cast. Humfrey never could be other than Cicely's devoted champion and guardian, and it was better that it should be as her husband. So he repaired to Sir Amias and told him that he desired not to expose his daughter's tender years and feeble spirits to the sight of the Queen's death, and claimed permission to take her away with him the next day, saying that the permission of the Queen had already been granted through his son, whom he would gladly also take with him. Paulett hemmed and hawed. He thought it a great error in Mr. Talbot to avoid letting his daughter be edified by a spectacle that might go far to moderate the contagion of intercourse with so obstinate a papist and deceiver. Being of pitiless mould himself, he was incapable of appreciating Richard's observation that compassion would only increase her devotion to the unfortunate lady. He would not or could not part with Humfrey. He said that there would be such a turmoil and concourse that the services of the captain of his yeomen would be indispensable, but that he himself and all the rest would be free on the Thursday at latest. Mr. Talbot's desire to be away was a surprise to him, for he was in difficulties how, even in that enormous hall, to dispose of all who claimed by right or by favour to witness what he called the tardy fulfilment of judgment. Yet though he thought it a weakness, he did not refuse, and ere night Mr. Talbot was able to send formal word that the horses would be ready for Mistress Cicely at break of day the next morning. The message was transmitted through the ladies as the Queen sat writing at her table, and she at once gave orders to Elizabeth Curll to prepare the cloak bag with the necessaries for the journey. Cicely cried out, "Oh, madam, my mother, do not send me from you." "There is no help for it, little one. It is the only hope of safety or happiness for thee." "But I pledged myself to await Queen Elizabeth's reply here." "She has replied," said Mary. "How?" cried Cicely. "Methought your letter confirming mine offers had not yet been sent." "It hath not, but she hath made known to me that she rejects thy terms, my poor maid." "Is there then no hope?" said the girl under her breath, which came short with dismay. "Hope? Yea," said Mary, with a ray of brightness on her face, "but not earthly hope. That is over, and I am more at rest and peace than I can remember to have been since I was a babe at my mother's knee. But, little one, I must preserve thee for thine Humfrey and for happiness, and so thou must be gone ere the hounds be on thy track." "Never, mother, I cannot leave you. You bid no one else to go," said Cis, clinging to her with a face bathed in tears. "No one else is imperilled by remaining, as thy bold venture has imperilled thee, my sweet maid. Think, child, how fears for thee would disturb my spirit, when I would fain commune only with heaven.
Seest thou not that to lose thy dear presence for the few days left to me will be far better for me than to be rent with anxiety for thee? And it may be to see thee snatched from me by these stern, harsh men." "To quit you now! It is unnatural. I cannot." "You will go, child. As queen and as mother alike, I lay my commands on you. Let not the last, almost the only commands I ever gave thee be transgressed, and waste not these last hours in a vain strife." She spoke with an authority against which Cis had no appeal, save by holding her hand tight and covering it with kisses and tears. Mary presently released her hand and went on writing, giving her a little time to restrain her agony of bitter weeping. The first words spoken were, "I shall not name thee in my will, nor recommend thee to thy brother. It would only bring on thee suspicion and danger. Here, however, is a letter giving full evidence of thy birth, and mentioning the various witnesses who can attest it. I shall leave the like with Melville, but it will be for thy happiness and safety if it never sees the light. Should thy brother die without heirs, then it might be thy duty to come forward and stretch out thy hand for these 2 crowns, which have more thorns than jewels in them. Alas! would that I could dare hope that they might be exchanged for a crown of stars. But lie down on the bed, my bairnie. I have much still to do, and thou hast a long journey before thee." Cicely would fain have resisted, but was forced to obey, though protesting that she should not sleep, and she lay awake for a long time watching the Queen writing, until unawares slumber overpowered her eyes. When she awoke, the Queen was standing over her, saying, "It is time thou wert to stir, little one." "Oh, and have I lost all these hours of you?" cried Cicely, as her senses awoke to the remembrance of the situation of affairs. "Mother, why did you not let me watch with you?" Mary only smiled and kissed her brow. The time went by in the preparations, in all of which the Queen took an active part. Her money and jewels had been restored to her by Elizabeth's orders during her daughter's absence, and she had put 20 gold pieces in the silken and pearl purse which she always used. "More may I not give thee," she said. "I know not whether I shall be able to give my poor servants enough to carry them to their homes. This thou must have to provide thee, and for my jewels they should be all thine by right, but the more valuable ones which bear tokens might only bring thee under suspicion, poor child." She wished Cicely to choose among them, but the poor girl had no heart for choice, and the Queen herself put in her hand a small case containing a few which were unobtrusive, yet well known to her, and among them a ring with the Hepburn arms given by Bothwell. She also showed her a gold chain which she meant to give to Humfrey. In this manner time passed till a message came in that Master Richard Talbot was ready. "Who brought it?" asked the Queen, and when she heard that it was Humfrey himself who was at the door, she bade him to be called in. "Children," she said, "we were interrupted last night. Let me see you give your betrothal kiss and bless you." "One word, my mother," said Cicely. "Humfrey will not bear me ill will if I say that while there can still be any hope that Queen Elizabeth will accept me for her prisoner in your stead, I neither can nor ought to wed him." "Thou mayst safely accept the condition, my son," said Mary. "Then if these messengers should come to conduct my mother abroad, and to take me as her hostage, Humfrey will know where to find me." "Yea, thou art a good child to the last, my little one," said Mary. "You promise, Humfrey?" said Cicely. "I do," he said, knowing as well as the Queen how little chance there was that he would be called on to fulfil it, but feeling the agony of the parting was thus in some degree softened to Cicely. Mary gave the betrothal ring to Humfrey, and she laid her hands on their clasped ones. "My daughter and my son," she said, "I leave you my blessing. If filial love and unshaken truth can bring down blessings from above, they will be yours. Think of your mother in times to come as one who hath erred, but suffered and repented. If your Church permits you, pray often for her. Remember when you hear her blamed, that in the glare of courts she had none to breed her up in godly fear and simple truth, like your good mother at Bridgefield, but that she learnt to think what you view in the light of deadly sin as the mere lawful instruments of government, above all for the weaker. Condemn her not utterly, but pray, Pray with all your hearts that her God and Saviour will accept her penitence and unite her sufferings with those of her Lord, since he has done her the grace of letting her die in part for his church. Now," she added, kissing each brow, and then holding her daughter in her embrace, "take her away, Humfrey, and let me turn my soul from all earthly loves and cares."
End of chapter 43. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. Chapter 44 of Unknown to History by Charlotte Mary Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. On the Humber. Master Talbot had done considerately in arranging that Cicely should at least begin her journey on a pillion behind himself, for her anguish of suppressed weeping unfitted her to guide a horse, and would have attracted the attention of any serving man behind whom he could have placed her, whereas she could lay her head against his shoulder, and feel a kind of dreary repose there. He would have gone by the more direct way to Hull, through Lincoln, but that he feared that February Filldyke would have rendered the fens impassable, so he directed his course more to the north-west. Cicely was silent, crushed, but more capable of riding than of anything else. In fact, the air and motion seemed to give her a certain relief. He meant to halt for the night at a large inn in Nottingham. There was much stir in the court, and it seemed to be full of the train of some great noble. Richard knew not whether to be glad or sorry when he perceived the Shrewsbury colours and the silver mastiff badge, and was greeted by a cry of "Master Richard of Bridgefield!" 2 or 3 retainers of higher degree came round him as he rode into the yard, and while demanding his news, communicated their own, that my lord was on his way to Fotheringay to preside at the execution of the Queen of Scots. He could feel Cicely's shudder as he lifted her off her horse, and he replied repressively, "I am bringing my daughter from thence." "Come in and see my lord," said the gentleman. "He is a woeful man at the work that is put on him." Lord Shrewsbury did indeed look sad, almost broken, as he held out his hand to Richard and said, "This is a piteous errand, cousin, on which I am bound, and thou, my young kinswoman, thou didst not succeed with her Majesty." "She is sick with grief and weariness," said Richard. "I would fain take her to her chamber." The evident intimacy of the newcomers with so great a personage as my lord procured for them better accommodation than they might have otherwise have had, and Richard obtained for Cicely a tiny closet within the room where he himself was to sleep. He even contrived that she should be served alone, partly by himself, partly by the hostess, a kind motherly woman, to whom he committed her while he supped with the Earl, and was afterwards called into his sleeping chamber to tell him of his endeavours at treating with Lord and Lady Talbot, and also to hear his lamentations over the business he had been sent upon. He had actually offered to make over his office as Earl Marshal to Burghley for the nonce, but as he said that all of the nobles in England such work should fall to the lot of him, who had been for 14 years the poor lady's host, and knew her admirable patience and sweet condition, was truly hard. Moreover, he was joined in the commission with the Earl of Kent, a sour Puritan, who would rejoice in making her drink to the dregs of the cup of bitterness. He was sick at heart with the thought. Richard represented that he would at least be able to give what comfort could be derived from mildness and compassion. "Not I, not I," said the poor man, always weak. "Not with those harsh yoke fellows, Kent and Paulet, to drive me on, and that vile Beale to report to the Privy Council any strain of mercy as mere treason. What can I do?" "You would do much, my lord, if you would move them to restore for these last hours to her those faithful servants, Melville and Depew, whom Paulet hath seen fit to seclude from her. It is rank cruelty to let her die without the sacraments of her church, when her conscience would not let her accept ours." "It is true, Richard, over true. I will do what I can, but I doubt me whether I shall prevail, where Paulet looks on a mass as mere idolatry, and will not brook that it should be offered in his house. But come you back with me, kinsman. We will send old Master Purvis to take your daughter safely home." Richard of course refused, and at the same time, thinking an explanation necessary and due to the Earl, disclosed to him that Cicely was no child of his, but a near kinswoman of the Scottish Queen, whom it was desirable to place out of Queen Elizabeth's reach for the present, adding that there had been love passages between her and his son Humfrey, who intended to wed her and see some foreign service. Lord Shrewsbury offered at first some offence at having been kept in ignorance all these years of such a fact, and wondered what his Countess would say; marvelled too that his cousin should consent to his son's throwing himself away on a mere stranger, of perilous connection, and going off to foreign wars. But the good nobleman was a placable man, and always considerably influenced by the person who addressed him, and he ended by placing the Mastiff at Richard's disposal to take the young people to Scotland or Holland, or wherever they might wish to go. This decided Mr. Talbot on making at once for the seaport, and accordingly he left behind him the horse which was to serve as a token to his son that such was his course. Cicely had been worn out with her day's journey, and slept late and sound, so that she was not ready to leave her chamber till the Earl and his retinue were gone, and thus she was spared actual contact with him who was to doom her mother, and see that doom carried out. She was recruited by rest, and more ready to talk than on the previous day, but she was greatly disappointed to find that she might not be taken to Bridgefield. "If only I could be with Mother Susan for 1 hour," she sighed. "Would that thou couldst, my poor maid," said Richard. "The mother hath the trick of comfort." "'Twas not comfort I thought of. None can give me that," said the poor girl. "But she would teach me how to be a good wife to Humfrey." These words were a satisfaction to Richard, who had begun to feel somewhat jealous for his son's sake, and to doubt whether the girl's affection rose to the point of requiting the great sacrifice made for his sake, though truly in those days parents were not wont to be solicitous as to the mutual attachment between a betrothed pair. However, Cicely's absolute resignation of herself and her fate into Humfrey's hands, without even a question, and with entire confidence and peace, was evidence enough that her heart was entirely his. Nay, had been his, throughout all the little flights of ambition now so entirely passed away, without apparently a thought on her part. It was on the Friday forenoon, a day very unlike the last entrance into Hull, that they again entered the old town in the brightness of a crisp frost, but poor Cicely could not but contrast her hopeful mood of November with her present overwhelming sorrow, where, however, there was one drop of sweetness. Her foster father took her again to good Mr. Heatherthwayte's, according to the previous invitation, and was rejoiced to see that the joyous welcome of Oil of Gladness awoke a smile, and the little girl, being well trained in soberness and discretion, did not obtrude upon her grief. Stern Puritan as he was, the minister himself contained his satisfaction that the Papist woman was to die, and never reign over England until he was out of hearing of the pale maiden who had, strange as it seemed to him, loved her enough to be almost broken-hearted at her death. Richard saw Goatley, and set him to prepare the Mastiff for an immediate voyage. Her crew, somewhat like those of a few modern yachts, were permanently attached to her, and lived in the neighbourhood of the wharf, so that, under the personal superintendence of one who was as much loved and looked up to as Captain Talbot, all was soon in a state of forwardness, and Gillingham made himself very useful. When darkness put a stop to the work, and supper was being made ready, Richard found time to explain matters to Mr. Heatherthwayte, for his honourable mind would not permit him to ask his host, unawares, to perform an office that might possibly be construed as treasonable. In spite of the preparation which he had already received through Colet's communications, the minister's wonder was extreme. "Daughter to the Queen of Scots, say you, sir? Yonder modest, shamefast maiden of such seemly carriage and gentle speech?" Richard smiled and said, "My good friend, had you seen that poor lady, to whom God be merciful, as I have done, you would know that what is sweetest in our Cicely's outward woman is derived from her. For the inner graces I cannot but trace them to mine own good wife." Mr. Heatherthwayte seemed at first hardly to hear him, so overpowered was he with the notion that the daughter of her whom he was in the habit of classing with Athaliah and Herodias was in his house, resting on the innocent pillow of Oil of Gladness. He made his guest recount to him the steps by which the discovery had been made, and at last seemed to embrace the idea. Then he asked whether Master Talbot were about to carry the young lady to the protection of her brother in Scotland, and when the answer was that it might be poor protection even if conferred, and that by all accounts the court of Scotland was by no means a place in which to leave a lonely damsel with no faithful guardian, the minister asked, "How then will you bestow the maiden?" "In that, sir, I came to ask you to aid me. My son Humphrey is following on our steps, leaving Fotheringay so soon as his charge there is ended, and I ask of you to wed him to the maid, whom we will then take to Holland, when he will take service with the States." The amazement of the clergyman was redoubled, and he began at first to plead with Richard that a perilous overleaping ambition was leading him thus to mate his son with an evil though a royal race. At this Richard smiled and shook his head, pointing out that the very last thing any of them desired was that Cicely's birth should be known, and that even if it were, her mother's marriage was very questionable. It was no ambition, he said, that actuated his son. "But you saw for yourself how, 19 years ago, the little lad welcomed her as his little sister come back to him. That love hath grown up with him. When at 15 years old he learnt that she was a nameless stranger, his first cry was that he would wed her and give her his name. Never hath his love faltered, and even when this misfortune of her rank was known, and he lost all hope of gaining her, while her mother bade her renounce him, his purpose was even still to watch over and guard her, and at the end, beyond all our expectations, they have had her mother's dying blessing and entreaty that he would take her." "Sir, do you give me your word for that?" "Yea, Master Heatherthwayte, as I am a true man. Mind you, worldly matters look as different to a poor woman who knoweth the headsman is in the house, as to one who hath her head on her dying pillow. This Queen had devised plans for sending our poor Cis abroad to her French and Lorraine kindred, with some of the French ladies of her train." "Heaven forbid!" broke out Heatherthwayte in horror. "The rankest of papists!" "Even so, and with recommendations to give her in marriage to some adventurous prince whom the Spaniards might abet in working woe to us in her name. But when she saw how staunch the child is in believing as mine own good dame taught her, she saw no doubt that this would be mere giving her over to be persecuted and mewed in a convent." "Then the woman hath some bowels of mercy, though a papist." "She even saith that she doubteth not that such as live honestly and faithfully by the light that is in them shall be saved. So when she saw she prevailed nothing with the maid, she left off her endeavours. Moreover, my son not only saved her life, but won her regard by his faith and honour, and she called him to her, and even besought him to be her daughter's husband. I came to you, reverend sir, as one who has known from the first that the young folk are no kin to one another, and as I think the peril to you is small, I deemed that you would do them this office. Otherwise I must take her to Holland and see them wedded by a stranger there." Mr. Heatherthwayte was somewhat touched, but he sat and considered, perceiving that to marry the young lady to a loyal Englishman was the safest way of hindering her from falling into the clutches of a popish prince. But he still demurred, and asked how Mr. Talbot could talk of the mere folly of love, and for its sake let his eldest son and heir become a mere exile and fugitive, cut off it might be from home. "For that matter, sir," said Richard, "my son is not one to loiter about, as the lubberly heir, cumbering the land at home. He would, so long as I am spared in health and strength, be doing service by land or sea, and I trust that by the time he is needed at home, all this may be so forgotten that Cis may return safely. The maid hath been our child too long for us to risk her alone, and for such love being weak and foolish, surely, sir, it was the voice of one greater than you or I that bade a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife." Mr. Heatherthwayte still murmured something about youth and lightly undertaken, and Master Talbot observed with a smile that when he had seen Humfrey he might judge as to the lightness of purpose. Richard meanwhile was watching somewhat anxiously for the arrival of his son, who he had reckoned would make so much more speed than was possible for Cis, that he might almost have overtaken them, if the fatal business had not been delayed longer than he had seen reason to anticipate. However, these last words had not long been out of his mouth, when a man's footsteps, eager, yet with a tired sound and with the clank of spurs, came along the paved way outside, and there was a knock at the door. Someone else had been watching, for as the street door was opened, Cicely sprang forward as Humfrey held out his arms. Then, as she rested against his breast, he said, so that she alone could hear, "Her last words to me were, 'Give her my love and blessing, and tell her my joy is come. Such joy as I never knew before.'" Then they knew the deed was done, and Richard said,
God have mercy on her soul." Nor did Mr. Heatherthwayte rebuke him. Indeed, there was no time, for Humfrey exclaimed, "She is swooning." He gathered her in his arms, and carried her where they lighted him, laying her on Oil's little bed, but she was not entirely unconscious, and rallied her senses so as to give him a reassuring look, not quite a smile, and yet wondrously sweet, even in the eyes of others. Then, as the lamp flashed on his figure, she sprang to her feet, all else forgotten in the exclamation, "Oh, Humfrey, thou art hurt! What is it? Sit thee down." They then saw that his face was indeed very pale and jaded, and that his dress was muddied from head to foot, and in some places there were marks of blood. But as she almost pushed him down on the chest beside the bed, he said in a voice hoarse and sunk, betraying weariness, Naught, sis. Only my beast fell with me going down a hill and lamed himself, so that I had to lead him the last 4 or 5 miles. Moreover, this cut on my hand must needs break forth bleeding more than I knew in the dark, or I had not frighted thee by coming in such a sorry plight." And he in his turn gazed reassuringly into her eyes as she stood over him, anxiously examining, as if she scarce durst trust him, that if stiff and bruised at all, it mattered not. Then she begged a cup of wine for him, and sent Oil for water and linen, and Humfrey had to abandon his hand to her, to be cleansed and bound up, neither of them uttering a word more than needful, as she knelt by the chest, performing this work with skilful hands, though there was now and then a tremor over her whole frame. "Now, dear maid," said Richard, "thou must let him come with us and don some dry garments. Then thou shalt see him again."
"Rest and food. He needs them," said Cis, in a voice weak and tremulous, though the self-restraint of a princely nature strove to control it. "Take him, father. Methinks I cannot hear more to-night. He will tell me all when we are away together. I would be alone and in the dark. I know he is come, and you are caring for him. That is enough, and I can still thank God." Her face quivered, and she turned away. Nor did Humfrey dare to shake her further by another demonstration, but stumbled after his father to the minister's chamber, where some incongruous clerical attire had been provided for him, since he disdained the offer of supping in bed. Mr. Heatherthwayte was much struck with the undemonstrativeness of their meeting, for there was high esteem for austerity in the Puritan world, in contrast to the utter want of self-restraint shown by the more secular characters. When Humfrey presently made his appearance with his father's cloak wrapped over the minister's clean shirt and nether garments, Richard said, "Son Humfrey, this good gentleman who baptized our Cis would fain be certain that there is no lightness of purpose in this thy design." "Nay, nay, Mr. Talbot," broke in the minister, "I spake ere I had seen this gentleman. From what I have now beheld, I have no doubts that be she whom she may, it is a marriage made and blessed in heaven." "I thank you, sir," said Humfrey gravely. "It is my one hope fulfilled." They spoke no more till he had eaten, for he was much spent, having never rested more than a couple of hours, and not slept at all since leaving Fotheringay. He had understood by the colour of the horse left at Nottingham which road to take, and at the hostel at Hull had encountered Gillingham, who directed him on to Mr. Heatherthwayte's. What he brought himself to tell of the last scene at Fotheringay has been mostly recorded by history, and need not here be dwelt upon. When Burgoyne and Melville fell back, unable to support their mistress along the hall to the scaffold, the Queen had said to him, "Thou wilt do me this last service," and had leant on his arm along the crowded hall, and had taken that moment to speak those last words for Cicely. She had blessed James openly, and declared her trust that he would find salvation if he lived well and sincerely in the faith he had chosen. With him she had secretly blessed her other child. Humfrey was much shaken, and could hardly command his voice to answer the questions of Master Heatherthwayte, but he so replied to them that, one by one, the phrases and turns were relinquished which the worldly man had prepared for a Sunday sermon on "Go see now this accursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter," and he even began to consider of choosing for his text something that would bid his congregation not to judge after the sight of their eyes, nor condemn after the hearing of their ears. When Humfrey had eaten and drunk, and the ruddy hue was returning to his cheek, Mr. Heatherthwayte discovered that he must speak with his churchwarden that night. Probably the pleasure of communicating the tidings that the deed was accomplished added force to the consideration that the father and son would rather be alone together, for he lighted his lantern with alacrity, and carried off Dust and Ashes with him. Then Humfrey had more to tell which brooked no delay. On the day after the departure of his father in Sicily, Will Cavendish had arrived, and Humfrey had been desired to demand from the prisoner an immediate audience for that gentleman. Mary had said, "This is anent the child. Call him in, Humfrey." And as Cavendish had passed the guard, he had struck his old comrade on the shoulder and observed, "What gulls we have at Hallamshire!" He had come out of his conference fuming and desiring to hear from Humfrey whether he were aware of the imposture that had been put on the Queen and upon them all, and to which yonder stubborn woman still chose to cleave, little Cis Talbot supposing herself a Queen's daughter, and they all, even grave Master Richard, being duped. It was too much for Will. A gentleman so nearly connected with the Privy Council was not to be deceived like these simple soldiers and sailors, though it suited Queen Mary's purposes to declare the maid to be in sooth her daughter, and to refuse to disown her. He supposed it was to embroil England for the future that she left such a seed of mischief. And old Paulett had been fool enough to let the girl leave the castle, whereas Cavendish's orders had been to be as secret as possible, lest the mischievous suspicion of the existence of such a person should spread, but to arrest her and bring her to London as soon as the execution should be over, when, as he said, no harm would happen to her, provided she would give up the pretensions with which she had been deceived. "It would have been safer for you both," said poor Queen Mary to Humfrey afterwards, "if I had denied her, but I could not disown my own poor child, or prevent her from yet claiming royal rights. Moreover, I have learnt enough of you Talbots to know that you would not owe your safety to falsehood from a dying woman." But Will's conceit might be quite as effectual. He was under orders to communicate the matter to no one not already aware of it, and as above all things he desired to see the execution as the most memorable spectacle he was likely to behold in his life, and he believed Cicely to be safe at Bridgefield, he thought it unnecessary to take any farther steps until that should be over. Humfrey had listened to all with what countenance he might, and gave as little sign as possible. But when the tragedy had been consummated, and he had seen the fair head fall, and himself withdrawn poor little Bijou from beneath his dead mistress's garment, handing him to Jean Kennedy, he had, with blood still curdling with horror, gone down to the stables, taken his horse, and ridden away. There would no doubt be pursuit so soon as Richard and Cicely were not to be found at Bridgefield, but there was a space in which to act, and Mr. Talbot at once said, "The Mastiff is well nigh ready to sail. Ye must be wedded to-morrow morn, and go on board without delay." They judged it better not to speak of this to the poor bride in her heavy grief, and Humfrey, having heard from their little hostess that Mistress Cicely lay quite still, and sent him her loving greeting, consented to avail himself of the hospitable minister's own bed, hoping, as he confided to his father, that very weariness would hinder him from seeing the block, the axe, and the convulsed face that had haunted him on the only previous time when he had tried to close his eyes. Long before day, Cicely heard her father's voice bidding her awake and dress herself, and handing in a light. The call was welcome, for it had been a night of strange dreams and sadder wakings to the sense it had come at last, yet the one comfort, Humfrey is near. She dressed herself in those plain black garments she had assumed in London, and in due time came down to where her father awaited her. She was pale, silent, and passive, and obeyed mechanically as he made her take a little food. She looked about as if for someone, and he said, "Humfrey will meet us anon." Then he himself put on her cloak, hood, and muffler. She was like one in a dream, never asking where they were going, and thus they left the house. There was light from a waning moon, and by it he led her to the church. It was a strange wedding in that morning moonlight streaming in at the east window of that grand old church, and casting the shadows of the columns and arches on the floor, only aided by one wax light, which, as Mr. Heatherthwayte took care to protest, was not placed on the holy table out of superstition, but because he could not see without it. Indeed, the table stood lengthways in the centre aisle, and would have been bare even of a white cloth, had not Richard begged for a communion for the young pair to speed them on their perilous way, and Mr. Heatherthwayte, almost under protest, consented, since a sea voyage and warlike service in a foreign land lay before them. But except that he wore no surplice, he had resigned himself to Master Richard on that most unnatural morning, and stifled his inmost sighs when he had to pronounce the name bride, given not by himself, but by some Romish priest, when the bridegroom, with the hand wounded for Queen Mary's sake, gave a ruby ring, most unmistakably coming from that same perilous quarter, and above all when the pair and the father knelt in deep reverence. Yet their devotion was evidently so earnest and so heartfelt that he knew not how to blame it, and he could not but bless them with his whole heart as he walked down with them to the wharf. All were silent, except that Cicely once paused and said she wanted to speak to father. He came to her side, and she took his arm instead of Humfrey's. "Sir," she said, "it has come to me that now my sweet mother is left alone, it would be no small joy to her, and of great service to our good host's little daughter, if Oil of Gladness could take my place at home for a year or two."
"None will do that, Cis, but there is much that would be well in the notion, and I will consider of it. She is a maid of good conditions, and the mother is lonesome."
His consideration resulted in his making the proposal, much startling, though greatly gratifying. Master Heatherthwayte, who thanked him, talked of his honour for that discreet and goodly woman, Mistress Susan, and said he must ponder and pray upon it, and would reply when Mr. Talbot returned from his voyage. At the wharf lay the Mastiff's boat in charge of Gervase and Gillingham. All three stepped into it together, the most silent bride and bridegroom perhaps that the Humber had ever seen. Only each of the three wrung the hand of the good clergyman. At that moment all the bells in Hull broke forth with a joyous peal, which by the association made the bride look up with a smile. Her husband forced one in return, but his father's eyes, which she could not see, filled with tears. He knew it was an exultation at her mother's death, and they hurried into the boat lest she should catch the purport of the shouts that were beginning to arise as the townsfolk awoke to the knowledge that their enemy was dead. The fires of Smithfield were in the remembrance of this generation. The cities of Flanders were writhing under the Spanish yoke. The richest spoils of Mexico, the stoutest hearts of Spain, were already mustering to reduce England to the condition of Antwerp or Haarlem, and only Elizabeth's life had seemed to lie between them and her who was bound by her religion to bring all this upon the peaceful land. No wonder those who knew not the issue of cruel deceits and treacheries that had worked the final ruin of the captive, and believed her guilty of fearful crimes, should have burst forth in a wild tumult of joy, such as saddened even the Protestant soul of Mr. Heatherthwayte, as he turned homewards after giving his blessing to the mournful young girl, whom the boat was bearing over the muddy waters of the Hull. They soon had her on board, but the preparations were hardly yet complete, nor could the vessel make her way down the river till the evening tide. It was a bright, clear day, and a seat on deck was arranged for the lady, where she sat with Humfrey beside her, holding her cloak round her, and telling her, strange theme for a bridal day, all he thought well to tell her of those last hours, when Mary had truly shown herself purified by her long patience, and exalted by the hope that her death had in it somewhat of martyrdom. His father meantime superintended the work of the crew, being extremely anxious to lose no time, and to sail before night. Mr. Heatherthwayte's anxiety brought him on board again, for he wanted to ask more questions about the Bridgefield doings ere beginning his ponderings and his prayers respecting his decision for his little daughter. Nor had he taken his final leave when the anchor was at length weighed, and the ship had passed by the strange old gables, timbered houses, and open lofts that bounded the harbour out from the Hull river into the Humber itself, while both the Talbots breathed more freely. But as the chill air of evening made itself felt, they persuaded Cicely to let her husband take her down to her cabin. It was at this moment, in the deepening twilight, that the ship was hailed, and a boat came alongside, and there was a summons, "In the Queen's name," and a slightly made, lean figure in black came up the side. He was accompanied by a stout man, apparently a constable. There was a moment's pause, then the newcomer said, "Kinsman Talbot."
"I count no kindred with betrayers, Cuthbert Langston," said Richard, drawing himself up with folded arms.
"Scorn me not, Richard Talbot," was the reply. "You stood my friend once when none other did so, and for that cause I have hindered much hurt to you and yours. But for me you had been in a London jail for 3 weeks past. Nor do I come to you to do evil now. Give up the wench, and your name shall never be brought forward, since the matter is to be private. Behold a warrant from the Council empowering me to bring before them the person of Bride Hepburn, otherwise called Cicely Talbot."
"Man of treacheries and violence," said Mr. Heatherthwayte, standing forward, an imposing figure in his full black gown and white ruff, "go back! The lady is not for thy double dealing, nor is there now any such person as either Bride Hepburn or Cicely Talbot."
"I cry you mercy,"
sneered Langston. "I see how it is. I shall have to bear your reverence likewise away for a treasonable act in performing the office of matrimony for a person of royal blood without the consent of the Queen, and your reverence knows the penalty."
At that instant there rang from the forecastle a never-to-be-forgotten howl of triumphant hatred and fury, and with a spring like that of a tiger, Gillingham bounded upon him with a shout, "Remember Babington!" and grappled with him, dragging him backwards to the bulwark. Richard and the constable both tried to seize the fiercely struggling forms, but in vain. They were over the side in a moment, and there was a heavy splash into the muddy waters of the Humber, thick with the downcome of swollen rivers, thrown back by the flowing tide. Humfrey came dashing up from below, demanding who was overboard, and ready to leap to the rescue wherever any should point in the darkness, but his father withheld him, nor indeed was there sound or eddy to be perceived. "It is the manifest judgment of God," said Mr. Heatherthwayte in a low, awe-stricken voice. But the constable cried aloud that a murder had been done in resisting the Queen's warrant. With a ready gesture the minister made Humfrey understand that he must keep his wife in the cabin, and Richard at the same time called Mr. Heatherthwayte and all present to witness that, murder as it undoubtedly was, it had not been in resisting the Queen's warrant, but in private revenge of the servant Harry Gillingham for his master Babington, whom he believed to have been betrayed by this gentleman. It appeared that the constable knew neither the name of the gentleman nor whom the warrant mentioned. He had only been summoned in the Queen's name to come on board the Mastiff to assist in securing the person of a young gentlewoman, but who she was, or why she was to be arrested, the man did not know. He saw no lady on deck, and he was by no means disposed to make any search, and the presence of Master Heatherthwayte likewise impressed him much with the belief that all was right with the gentleman. Of course it would have been his duty to detain the Mastiff for an inquiry into the matter, but the poor man was extremely ill at ease in the vessel and among the retainers of my Lord of Shrewsbury, and in point of fact they might all have been concerned in a crime of much deeper dye without his venturing to interfere. He saw no one to arrest, the warrant was lost, the murderer was dead, and he was thankful enough to be returned to his boat with Master Richard Talbot's assurance that it was probable that no inquiry would be made, but that if it were, the pilot would be there to bear witness of his innocence, and that he himself should return in a month at latest with the Mastiff. Master Heatherthwayte consoled the constable further by saying he would return in his boat and speak for him if there were any inquiry after the other passenger. "I must speak my farewells here," he said, "and trust we shall have no coil to meet you on your return, Master Richard." "But for her," said Humfrey, "I could not let my father face it alone. When she is in safety—" "Tush, lad," said his father. "Such plotters as yonder poor wretch had become are not such choice prizes as to be inquired for. Men are only too glad to be rid of them when their foul work is done." "So farewell, good Master Heatherthwayte," added Humfrey, "with thanks for this day's work. I have read of good and evil geniuses or angels, be they which they may, haunting us for life and striving for the mastery. Methinks my Cis hath found both on the same Humber which brought her to us." "Nay, go not forth with pagan or popish follies on thy tongue, young man," said Heatherthwayte, "but rather pray that the blessing of the Holy One, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of thy father, may be with thee and thine in this strange land, and bring thee safely back in his own time, and surely he will bless the faithful." And Richard Talbot said Amen. End of chapter 44. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. Chapter 45 of Unknown to History by Charlotte Mary Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama. 10 years after. It was 10 years later, in the reign of Elizabeth, when James VI was under one of his many eclipses of favour, and when the united English and Dutch fleets had been performing gallant exploits at Cadiz and Terceira, that licence for a few weeks' absence was requested for one of the lieutenants in Her Majesty's Guard, Master Richard Talbot. "And wherefore?" demanded the royal lady of Sir Walter Raleigh, the captain of her guard, who made the request.
"To go to the Hague to look after his brother's widow and estate, so please your Majesty. More's the pity," said Raleigh. "His brother's widow!" repeated the Queen. "Yea, madam, for it may be feared that young Humfrey Talbot, I know not whether your Majesty ever saw him, but he was my brave brother Humfrey Gilbert's godson, and sailed with us to the west some 16 years back. He was as gallant a sailor as ever trod a deck, and I never could see why he thought it fit to take service with the States. But he did good work in the time of the Armada, and I saw him one of the foremost in the attack on Cadiz. Nay, he was one of those knighted by my Lord of Essex in the market-place. Then he sailed with my Lord of Cumberland for the Azores, now 6 months hence, and hath not since been heard of, as his brother tells me, and therefore doth Talbot request this favour of your Majesty." "Send the young man to me," returned the Queen.
Diccon, to give him his old name, was not quite so unsophisticated as when his father had first left him in London. Though a good deal shocked by what a new arrival from Holland had just told him of the hopelessness of ever seeing the Ark of Fortune and her captain again, he was not so overpowered with grief as to prevent him from being full of excitement and gratification at the honour of an interview with the Queen, and he arranged his rich scarlet and gold attire so as to set himself off to the best advantage, that so he might be pronounced a proper man. Queen Elizabeth was now some years over 60, and her nose and chin began to meet, but otherwise she was as well preserved as ever, and quite as alert and dignified. To his increased surprise she was alone, and as she was becoming a little deaf, she made him kneel very near her chair.
"So, Master Talbot," she said, "you are the son of Richard Talbot of Bridgefield."
"And so it please your Majesty."
"And you request license from us to go to the Hague?"
"And so it please your Majesty," repeated Diccon, wondering what was coming next, and as she paused for him to continue, "There are grave rumours and great fears for my brother's ship, he being in the Dutch service, and I would fain learn the truth and see what may be done for his wife."
"Who is his wife?"
demanded the Queen, fixing her keen, glittering eyes on him, but he replied with readiness, "She was an orphan brought up by my father and mother."
"Young man, speak plainly. No tampering serves here. She is the wench who came hither to plead for the Queen of Scots."
"Yea, madam," said Diccon, seeing that direct answers were required.
"Tell me truly," continued the Queen, "on your duty to your Queen, is she what she called herself?"
"To the best of my belief she is, madam," he answered.
"Look you, sir, Cavendish brought back word that it was all an ingenious figment which had deceived your father, mother, and the maid herself, and no wonder, since the Queen of Scots persisted therein to the last."
"Yea, madam, but my mother still keeps absolute proofs in the garments and the letter that were found on the child when recovered from the wreck. I had never known that she was not my sister till her journey to London, and when next I went to the north my mother told me the whole truth."
"I pray then, how suits it with the boasted loyalty of your house that this brother of yours should have wedded the maid?"
"Madam, it was not prudent, but he had never a thought save for her throughout his life. Her mother committed her to him, and holding the matter a deep and dead secret, he thought to do your Majesty no wrong by the marriage. If he erred, be merciful, madam."
"Pah, foolish youth! To whom should I be merciful, since the man is dead? No doubt he hath left half a score of children to be puffed up with the wind of their royal extraction."
"Not one, madam. When I last heard they were still childless."
"And now you are on your way to take on you the cheering of your sister-in-law, the widow,"
said the Queen, and as Diccon made a gesture of assent, she stretched out her hand and drew him closer.
"She is then alone in the world? She is my kinswoman, if so be she is all she calls herself. Now, Master Talbot, go not open-mouthed about your work, but tell this lady that if she can prove her kindred to me, and bring evidence of her birth at Lochleven, I will welcome her here, treat her as my cousin the Princess of Scotland, and it may be, put her on her way to higher preferment, so she prove herself worthy. You take me, sir?"
Diccon did take in the situation. He had understood how Cavendish, partly blinded by Langston, partly unwilling to believe in any competitor who would be nearer the throne than his niece Arabella Stuart, and partly disconcerted by Langston's disappearance, had made such a report to the Queen and the French ambassador that they had thought that the whole matter was an imposture, and had been so ashamed of their acquiescence as to obliterate all record of it. But the Queen's mind had since recurred to the matter, and as in those later years of her reign one of her constant desires was to hinder James from making too sure of the succession, she was evidently willing to play his sister off against him. Nay, in the general uncertainty, dreams came over Diccon of possible royal honours to Queen Bridget, and then what glories would be reflected on the house of Talbot! His father and mother were too old, no doubt, to bask in the sunshine of the court, and Ned, pity that he was a clergyman, and had done so dull a thing as to marry that little pupil of his mother's, Letitia, as he had rendered her Puritan name. But he might be made a bishop, and his mother's scholar would always become any station. And for Diccon himself, assuredly the Mastiff race would rejoice in a new coronet. 7 weeks later, Diccon was back again, and was once more summoned to the Queen's apartment. He looked crestfallen, and she began, "Well, sir, have you brought the lady?" "Not so, an it please your Majesty." "And wherefore? Fears she to come, or has she sent no message nor letter?" "She sends her deep and humble thanks, madam, for the honour your Majesty intended her, but she—" "How now? Is she too great a fool to accept of it?" "Yea, madam. She prays your Grace to leave her in her obscurity at the Hague." Elizabeth made a sound of utter amazement and incredulity, and then said, "This is new madness. Come, young man, tell me all. This is as good and new as ever was play. Let me hear. What is she like, and what is her house to be preferred to mine?" Diccon saw his cue, and began, "Her house, madam, is one of those tall Dutch mansions, with high roof, and many small windows therein, with a stoop or broad flight of stairs below, on the banks of a broad and pleasant canal, shaded with fine elm trees. There I found her, on the stoop in the shade, with 2 or 3 children around her, for she is a mother to all the English orphans there, and they are but too many. They bring them to her as a matter of course when their parents die, and she keeps them till their kindred in England claim them. Madam, her queenliness of port hath gained on her. Had she come, she would not have shamed your Majesty, and it seems that, none knowing her true birth, she is yet well nigh a princess among the many wives of officers and merchants who dwell at the Hague, and doubly so among the men, to whom she and her husband have never failed to do a kindness. Well, madam, I weary you. She greeted me as the tender sister she has ever been, but she would not brook to hear of fears or compassion for my brother. She would listen to no word of doubt that he was safe, but kept the whole household in perfect readiness for him to come. At last I spake your Majesty's gracious message, and, madam, pardon me, but all I got was a sound rating, that I should think any hope of royal splendour or preferment should draw her from waiting for Humfrey. Ay, she knew he would come, and if not, she would never be more than his faithful widow. Had he not given up all for her? Should she fail in patience because his ship tarried a while? No, he should find her ready in his home that he had made for her." "Why, this is as good as the Globe Theatre," cried the Queen, but with a tear glittering in her eye. "Your Majesty would have said so truly," said Diccon, "for as I sat at evening, striving hard to make her give over these fantastic notions and consult her true interest, behold, she gave a cry, ''Tis his foot!' And yea, verily, there was Humfrey, brown as a berry, having been so far with his mate as to the very mouth of the River Plate. He had indeed lost his ark of fortune, but he has come home with a carrack that quadruples her burthen, and with 1,000 bars of silver in her hold. And then, madam, the joy, the kisses, the embraces, and even more, the look of perfect content and peace and trust, were enough to make a bachelor long for a wife." "Long to be a fool!" broke out the Queen sharply. "Look you, lad, there may be such couples as this Humfrey and, what call you her, here and there." "My father and mother are such." "Yea, saucy cockerel as you are, but for one such there are 100 others who fret the yoke and long to be free. Ay, and this brother of thine, what hath he got with this wife of his but banishment and dread of his own land?" "Even so, madam, but they still count all they either could have had or hoped for, not in comparison with their love to one another." "After 10 years! Ha! They are no subjects for this real world of ours. Are they not rather swains in my poor Philip Sidney's Arcadia? Oh no, 'twere pity to meddle with them. Leave them to their Dutch household and their carracks. Let them keep their own secret. I'll meddle in the matter no more." And so, though after Elizabeth's death and James's accession, Sir Humfrey and Lady Talbot gladdened the eyes of the loving and venerable pair at Bridgefield, the Princess Bride of Scotland still remained in happy obscurity, unknown to history. End of chapter 45 and end of Unknown to History by Charlotte Mary Yonge. Recording by Tanica, Madison, Alabama.